As we move into the second half of the show, I do want to again say that the views and opinions expressed on today's program are not necessarily those of the board and staff or volunteers here at KMUD. So we are now ready to speak to our next guest. I will introduce him. Jordan, are we good on that? We're good on that. Okay. So I am going to be speaking with Reverend Graylan Hagler. And he is going to be talking about Martin Luther King and an article that he wrote and a celebration that he had at his church, which is the Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C. They had a Martin Luther King service. And it's looking at voting rights, racism, war, and poverty. Reverend Hagler has been on the program years ago, and this is his first time with us as on Heroes and Patriots. So I'd like to welcome Reverend Hagler to the program.
Thank you for having me on.
Hello there. How are you doing today?
I am doing well. Thank you so much.
Great. We can hear you fairly well, maybe a little closer to your microphone there. So we are going to talk about your article, and it's been many, many years since Martin Luther King has passed, and we recognize and celebrate his birthday each January. But I wondered if you could talk about your article and what was in it, and what do listeners need to know about it at this point?
Well, one of the things is that we focus so much on the personality, and the personality is real, and the personality was very prophetic. But we sometimes forget, and mostly this culture has forgotten, about the content of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and his vision and his work. We basically have, in a sense, presented and recreated a more smooth King so that it can be palatable. Just like I heard somebody say, oh, well, Martin Luther King, he really was working against bullying. To some extent, that's true, but it's a real serious mischaracterization of what the movement was about. Mm-hmm. The movement was about justice, and the movement was about nonviolence, which was a political tactic and not necessarily a way of life. Ella Jo Baker basically sort of brought in young folks into the movement to embrace that tactic, but also to understand that that tactic was to basically get them to a place in which they begin to take political power, political reins, those types of things. So what I'm just simply saying is that I think that we have totally mischaracterized Martin King, his anti-Vietnam stance. We don't hear much about that. His calling about America as being the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. We don't say much about that. When we talk about a realignment of the economic system in America, we don't hear very much about that. We avoid that. We basically focus upon the idea of Martin King. He had a dream, and we failed to fill in even the blanks of that dream, because even the "I have a dream" speech gets mischaracterized, because that was a call for people to go back home. They were going to show power and presence around the Voting Act in Washington, D.C., and then he urged people to go back to their villages and to their towns and agitate and continue to organize there. So it was really a calling to Washington to send people back into the field.
And when was this, through the years, you say this has changed. When do you think it really fundamentally changed, that his mission, his goal, that speech, the call to action, how has that changed, and when did it change? Was there one event that changed it?
Well, it changed with the acceptance of a Martin King holiday. Because how can you have a holiday with someone who is absolutely and categorically a critic of the economic system and the militarism and the racism of U.S.? So you got to basically take that and you got to change the narrative, make it palatable to the rest of the culture in terms of honoring Martin King. But you cannot take his philosophical and his theological points of view seriously.
Wow. It's been over 52 years. The black community today, and I'm thinking more of those who were not alive at the time or when he was killed and so forth. What is the feeling or about by our youth, our black African American youth today, about Martin Luther King? What sense do they have of him?
Well, I mean, I think that people really, young folks feel that there were sacrifices that were paid, but in some ways, I think young folks really feel that they have been betrayed by the movement in some ways that did not understand itself after the assassination of Martin King, after the murder of Martin King. Mm-hmm. Basically a movement that began in some ways to idolatrize nonviolence.
Right.
To make it an idol, right? When it was a tool. It was a way in which you carried yourself to win sympathy in a world that was really sort of nervous about black folks being too aggressive, about black folks screaming about justice. So it was a tool, but it works that you make that a idol in a sense, because then you can sort of say that anything that is strident somehow is not valid. You know, I mean, that was the whole struggle around the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
Whether the Black Lives Matter movement was congruent with the Civil Rights movement. Well, it is. It's a continuation of the Civil Rights movement. And we may not like the tactics, and some people may have angst at the tactics, but that's just what it is. And it's really, in a sense, how a younger generation view their political stance and view the tactics that they must employ.
Is that the only way that young folks today rally? Is there something that before Black Lives Matter, was there another replacement, if you will, of Martin Luther King's positions?
Well, a lot of the crime and the violence that's going on in the community is, in a sense, I believe it's because leadership has not been able to capture that anger and tell young folks that it's okay to be angry. We just need to, in a sense, organize the anger to be a political catalyst in the country. I think that what we see going on all the time, it gets mischaracterized, and particularly in terms of young folks, where young folks are not considered to be thinking about anything or feeling anything, when in fact they're feeling. Young black kids are angry because they see where, in many ways, the movement has left them high and dry.
Mm-hmm. You obviously are a reverend and belong to an organized church. How has through the years, where are young black folks in relation to the church? Do they still feel it as important in their lives, and can they follow these kinds of ideas through the church?
Well, we got a real dilemma that's going on in the church, and I think you can see it. It's a struggle right now between movements that are going to be progressive religious movements and those movements that are reactionary. Mm-hmm. I think the struggle right now is to try to be able to critique and evaluate white evangelicalism that is basically a racist theology, a racist, classist, sexist theology. And so what do we deal with that? Then we're also struggling with this prosperity theology that is very much out there and has very much shown itself to be bankrupt. And so, those things are there. And then there is the church that is struggling in terms of theology around being progressive and being liberative. I mean, I think that one thing that I can point out is that the Poor People's Campaign with my friend Reverend Dr. William Barber, mm-hmm. Is working to try to frame the faith community, particularly the progressive faith community, right, as a political movement. Because one thing that has happened is that those who have been progressive and those who have been liberal, they've been doing good things, they've been feeding people, they've been clothing people, they've been doing all that. but they did not and have not seen themselves as a political entity. Whereas the right evangelical church has seen itself as a political entity, has basically stewed its issues down to two issues, and that is abortion and homosexuality, and therefore they can tolerate the menace of a president like this one we got in the White House as long as he keeps mouthing the stuff around abortion and appearing to be attacking the LGBTQIA community.
Wow. Is there a sense, though, of where's the racist issue that so often Trump has been portrayed as a racist, and I don't offer my opinions. I would like to hear from you on that, and how do they justify the abortion and homosexuality versus a racist president?
Well, racism is not something that this evangelical movement has concerned itself with. Mm-hmm. In fact, if you go to most of the evangelical schools, Liberty, places like that, Regents, they don't even they teach that racism does not exist. That
really?
Racism becomes a crutch, and therefore all the folks that have come through these evangelical schools really stock themselves into the various departments in U.S. government, Justice Department, places like that. So then, therefore, in the Justice Department, you're hard pressed to come out with a civil rights crime or investigation into a civil rights crime, because fundamentally they believe that racism does not exist. And so that's not something to be critiqued, and it very much continues to preserve the racist character of the United States of America.
Wow. We're listening to Heroes and Patriots. Graylan Scott Hagler is my guest right now. If you'd like to ask him a question, the number to call is 707-923-3911, or you can write your question at heroesandpatriots@gmail.com. I wanted to focus a little bit on some of your previous activism, and you may want to express more about the Trump situation and what the State of the Union address, go for it if you'd like to. But I would like to address some of your ideas about the new Middle East peace plan that Trump has. We do have a caller. Before I ask that question, let's pick up a call here. Caller, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Reverend Hagler, for this absolutely brilliant discussion and really important. My question, though, is that Reverend King was so powerful in addressing the structural issues that resulted in the historical structural issues and the contemporary ones that lead to continued fault line of racism in this country. I'm wondering, with all the movements, how is it best? What are your thoughts on how best to address the structural, economic, and attitudinal issues that together combine to keep this a persistent American fault line?
Thank you, caller.
Well, I think that's a good question. It's a very difficult issue because it's just like I was listening the other day. They were talking to people about whether or not they were going to vote for this current president. And as one person said, I didn't vote for him last time, but my 401k is doing just fine. I'm going to vote for him this time. This is how limited we are in terms of our political perspective or in terms of our economic understanding as a country, as a nation. Where we are satisfied with the country of haves and have-nots. It was like after one State of the Union address. Mm-hmm. They brought Jindal out from Louisiana to be the Republican respondent, and he was responding to President Obama. And of course, he said this, and I'll never forget it because I thought it was a clear statement on his part. He says, Obama wants you to believe that we are a nation of have and have-nots. We Republicans believe that we're a country of haves and those who hope to have. And I think he defined it. Yeah. There's a delusion that exists where maybe I can be a millionaire, maybe I can be president, maybe I can, all that type of stuff that has been nurtured and has been put out there as part of our narrative that continues to keep us confused and not understanding exactly that this economic system is set up to help a few at the expense of all the rest of us.
Where are young people turning these days? What, if church attendance is not what it was, I know it is also true in some of the white churches. Where are young people gathering and forming ideas and creating their own agenda?
Well, I think there's all kinds of social structure that continue to bring young people together. Sometimes it's around the spoken word, and largely it's around music, and those are the kinds of things that sort of build the relationships among those young folks. What we also witness, though, to be very honest with the church, is that when young folks start to have children, they often come back to church. So there's a period where they may grow up in church and be in church, desert the church. Then when they have children, they come back to church looking for some stability and looking for a different sense of community.
A foundation,
a foundation. One of the problems is that the church, and the church, whether it is on the liberal side and definitely on the conservative side, engages in dumbing people down, not making people think, but giving people kinds of platitudes to be reassured and definitely not shaking up their spirit. I'll give you an example. The other day, I was looking at one of my colleagues, liberal colleagues, who tweeted out something, and his theological statement was, God loves everybody. And I felt that statement as very anemic. And so I text back, I said, God does not love everybody. Because in order to be engaged in an experience of love, you've got to be in relationship. And the epistle says, one of the epistles says, how can you claim to love God who you have not seen and hate your brother or sister that you have seen?
Right.
Because it is a relationship. And therefore, if I'm going to oppress people, if I'm going to put people down, if I'm going to destroy people, if I'm going to lock people up at the border, then I am not engaged in a relationship with God. And therefore, because I'm not engaged in a relationship, I'm not a recipient of God's love.
Right. Before we had our phone... Go ahead.
It becomes a kind of judgment that we fail in rendering as a community and saying to people, you're out of bounds. And I'm not talking about whether somebody's a homosexual or who they sleep with or any of that type of stuff. I'm talking about the way people treat one another.
Right. Before we had the phone call, I started to ask you about President Trump's and Benjamin Netanyahu's recent Israeli-Palestinian peace plan, and apparently the Palestinians were absent. Could you comment on that? Because I know you've been a staunch supporter of Palestinians and the way they've been mistreated throughout the years. Could you briefly speak to that in the 10 or so minutes we have left?
Sure, that was not a peace plan. That was a political agenda of deception and legitimization of Israel to be able to steal land and to practice basically a renewed apartheid against Palestinians. And when I say renewed, I mean on steroids. That they're going to seize, they're going to incorporate the illegal settlements into Israel proper. They supposedly have a plan for a state for Palestine, of a disarmed Palestine, all of those types of things. And so the thing is, it is a program of deception because there's nothing there for the Palestinians. There was not a discussion with the Palestinians. They were engaged in no way.
Right. One of the bullets is a statehood with no army and overarching Israeli security control in some areas, including over the sea. It also says that the Palestinian state would receive territory, mostly desert, near Gaza to compensate for the loss of about 30% of the West Bank. I'm
right,
sure.
And the clearest way to understand this, for me, is that it really is a statement that white supremacy that we're dealing with is a worldwide agenda, and Israel and America has just demonstrated that.
Right. This says that Trump said the economic portions of the plan, of course, it always goes back to money for Trump, would lead to 1 million new jobs for the Palestinians over the next 10 years with an investment of $50 billion in the new state and triple its GDP. I was just curious to know what you had thought of this because, as I say, it just happened like 10 days ago, and the Palestinians don't want anything to do with the United States now, is my understanding.
Right, of course. I wouldn't either, and because, you talk about money as somehow a bait that's going to allow people to be to submit their ideals to, but the reality is it's jobs that's going to end up as menial labor, slave wages. There's going to be no economic strength for Palestine because there can be no economic strength unless Palestine controls its own political and economic and agenda. You can't give somebody freedom by taking their land. You can't give somebody freedom by oppressing them further. It's just a ruse, and it's basically this plan is nothing but let me put it this way, a reality show played out again.
Yes, we know about those. I wanted to talk briefly about the Petra Foundation, which you have been involved in. Can you talk about the foundation, how it got started, and what it's about?
Yeah, the Petra Foundation was originally started in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A number of progressive activists, Harvard types, felt that they needed to help to resource some leaders out there, as well as to showcase the types of things that those leaders are concerned about and engaged in. And so out of that, the Petra Foundation was born.
But where does it come from? Is it, what does Petra stand for? I'm just trying to look here at some of this.
Petra was a woman named Petra Shattuck, who had passed, who had died of a brain hemorrhage, and her friends, because she was so concerned around Indian rights and things like that, her friends basically put together the foundation as a part of honoring her.
I see. And you're involved with that. In the few minutes that we have remaining, I wondered if you could just react briefly to what happened with the impeachment and what is happening with elections around the country as we go in full-blown elections mode, rather.
Well, the impeachment, I got to just put it this way, is what they were. The fact is he was impeached, and then when it went to trial in the Senate absolutely reneged on their responsibility of governance. And I say that because no matter which way they would have voted in the end, to truncate a process where they don't have a real trial with witnesses and documents, and therefore perusal of the information, only says that it was a sham. And I don't know any person who's been at trial that they did not have witnesses and documents against them, particularly black people. So this is, again, another statement of white privilege.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, most I would say Democrats at least, and many Americans feel that this is going to embolden Trump to continue his tactics, if you will. I was mentioning in the first part of the show that the FBI director has already said that this tapping into our elections, which is our rights, has continued since 2016, is already queued up to interfere with our 2020 elections. Do you have a comment on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's only thing I can say is that's where we are. That's where our government is right now. Right now, in many ways, the United States is a client of Russia.